Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you ever so much for joining us this afternoon. As you will see, my beard is getting longer by the day, but thankfully my Waitrose delivery time is getting shorter by the day. So the current lockdown kind of situation is having an effect on both sides. So just a short note before we start this week, here at Dallas, we've actually, by popular demand somewhat, put together a fantastic quiz that's going to be hitting your inbox over the next few days. So please do have a look at it, have a go at it, and have some fun having a look at it with maybe a glass of wine, which leads nicely, I suppose, into this week's subject matter. I suppose, along with gardening and Netflix, probably the most discussed topics at the moment in the household, I know they certainly are in mine, is probably wine. Joining me today is David Dallas, of course, to most people known as one of the world's most respected Old Masters experts. David is also somewhat of a sommelier. So David, tell us how and why you started to become interested in wine.
Alastair, thank you for those kind words. Just before we get going, I'd like to say that I've been the victim of an accident at home. My wife, Serena, never tastes her own cooking, and she asked me to try the Vietnamese dipping sauce that goes with the chicken we're having tonight. It was so hot, it made me sneeze rather violently, so I not only have bird's eye chili on the back of my throat, but down both nostrils as well. So I sound slightly strangulated.
But perhaps a nice glass of white might cure that, David.
That would definitely ease the pain. How did I get interested? I suppose, like most young men, I was interested in the things that my father loved. And my father knew a lot about wine. His particular skill, actually, was finding delicious wines that didn't cost very much. And on my birthday in the year I was married, which is 45 years ago, he gave me two books. One was called Wines of the World, and the other was called The Taste of Wine by Pamela Van Dyke Price. And I read them both from cover to cover. And then I was kind of hooked. And what I realized was I had a good visual memory, but I didn't have a particularly good memory for taste. So what I realized I had to do was to memorize what different wines tasted like, and therefore identify the grape variety. And if you could do that in those days, before wine was grown all over the world like it is now, if you could identify the grape variety, say Sangiovese or Tempranillo or whatever it was, you'd know where the wine came from in a blind tasting. And that's really how I got started.
Fantastic. David, just looking at the way in which you've looked at wine and collected wine over the years, can you tell us about some of your best buys? And do you have a different head on when you're buying something to drink as when you do as you're buying something as an investment, or do you maybe look at them as a whole?
I've never bought a bottle of wine as an investment, but of course, accidentally, they have turned out to be spectacularly good investments. I bought, for instance, in 2003, some first growth clarets. I bought Mouton Rothschild and Lafite. And then in 2009, and I tell you what I paid for them. I paid £675 a dozen. 2003 was the year of the Gulf War, and Robert Parker, for family reasons, in inverted commas, didn't go to France to assess the wines. So without his say-so, they were selling for ridiculously low prices compared to what they traditionally had been selling for. Then in 2009, when the world was falling on its face and I needed to raise some money, I sold those wines. And just 7 years later, I got 10 times what I'd paid for them. And because it's wine and classed as a diminishing asset, there's no capital gains tax. So those were pretty good. Even more spectacular and more embarrassing, and I'm glad my wife can't hear this, was buying on a friend's recommendation for the same sort of price, red Burgundies by Henri Jaillet. And I bought the 95, 96, 97, I bought 6 vintages of his wine, which is called Vin Romanicro Porentou. And I wasn't checking to see where the prices were going. And 10 years or so later, I started to drink the wines, and they were delicious, but to my mind, not absolutely spectacular. But I've just checked the price of the 99, of which I had a dozen, and the average price in March 2020 was just over $15,000 a bottle.
Gosh.
So I accidentally drank £500,000 worth of wine.
Well, that's quite a statement to be able to make, isn't it, really? Especially if you've had guests. But
Yes, I didn't drink them all myself. I did share them.
Sorry, was that the case that you sold back in 2009?
No, those were all clarets, first growth clarets, and they'd gone up tenfold. But the Burgundy had gone from 50 quid a bottle to 10 grand a bottle.
Do you think that's universal within red Burgundy at the moment?
I think red Burgundies in particular have done incredibly well. Unlike Bordeaux, the parcels of land are tiny. You might have read my thing about Romanée-Conti, came out last week. La Romanée-Conti is only 1.8 hectares. They produce fewer than 6,000 bottles a year, and the prices for old vintages are gigantic. I think Bonham sold a case last year for just under £250,000.
It's interesting when we talk about that. And in terms of collecting, I mean, you're talking about specific vintages. Now, when people are buying wine as investment in specific vintages, we can't obviously all go out and buy cases of 45 or 47 Petrus or an 86 Montrachet or something like that. But are there certain years that people flock to more than others?
Oh, absolutely. I'm no expert on Burgundy, but certainly certain claret years, 61, 70, 75, 82 was wonderful, 1990, 2000, 2005, 9, 10. All of those vintages will be much more valuable than the ones in between.
And is that, David, is that because of an opinion? I mean, obviously, you and I probably know about certain wine grading that there is, but to the ladies and gentlemen watching this, how would you explain why certain years are more valuable than other years? Is it a lack of stock? Is it a quality of a wine?
It'll be virtually always because the weather was perfect and therefore the quality of the wine was wonderful. In some years you can have a bumper crop of wonderful wine, and in some years it'll be in small supply, which will make it slightly more valuable. But it's all to do with the way the weather behaved. At the time the vines went into bud, and particularly in the late summer. And certain parts of the world, like Pommard and Volnay, are incredibly prone to hailstorms. And if you get a hailstorm when the fruit is starting to grow, well, it's bruised and it's damaged and it just won't work. And in fact, certain vineyards in those parts of Burgundy were so badly hit that the wine growers asked the French government to declare it a national emergency because they had no vintages for 4 years consecutively. So they got no product to sell. It wasn't even worth harvesting the wine, but you still had to go out in the spring and prune the vines and do all the other things.
So as a natural product, you are basically putting it all down to the weather, and obviously there is a tending of it to go with it, but the weather plays such a huge part. I wonder whether there's anything else that, any other product that we know of as an investment or something that people collect that has so much reliance on the weather.
I don't think there is. I mean, the French are now investing in various things that will compete with the elements. They've got machines that can blast up into the air and destroy the hail before it hits. But I mean, I think they're very expensive and that they're not universally used. And by French law, it's very odd. If you have a very, very dry summer and the vines start to become distressed, you're not allowed to water them. So the laws that govern what you can do in France, I don't know if that applies to other places. I shouldn't think it does for a minute. It's very strictly controlled. So you are the victim of the elements.
David, going back to the way in which people collect. Now, we touched briefly on years, but do people specifically collect from certain growers or certain vineyards? And do they kind of, in the collections that you've seen, do people kind of congregate around one specific area more than others?
Most of the collections I've seen have been quite broad-based, but most of the wines that I tend to see when I'm traveling, they tend to be the best French wines. So they're going to be top red and white Burgundies and all the best things from the Medoc and the Pomerol and Saint-Emilion. I should know more about Italian wine than I do, because my cousin Philip wrote the Faber and Faber book on Italian wines. A lot of people love the mighty Tuscans, or whatever they're called. Find all those wines. I noticed, coincidentally, wines being delivered to number 10. There were two cases. The top case was one of Champagne. The second one is Tignanello, I saw Boris is going great with.
Interesting choice.
Some of those big Tuscan wines that people collect in a big way, like Solaya and Sassicaia, I can't get to grips with them. Personally, I find them rather aggressive and over-extracted on the
brash.
way up.
I think brash is a word that I've heard used a lot with them.
Kind of wines that grab you by the neck, and they're just aggressive and brash. And I don't know, I think they have a very tiny plateau, because I've drunk some old ones and they just completely collapsed. So it's more of a spike than a plateau. There are great wines from California that people collect.
I was just about to touch on that, actually, David, in terms of an international market now. I think the Americans are kind of tapping in on it, obviously, because there's a lot of collectors of red, Burgundy and Claret in the States. But obviously, I think they're looking, towards a lot of their home produce as well. I think we were speaking the other day about somebody who unfortunately lost a significant amount in the fires that were there a few years ago and things like that. But there's a lot of good collections of American wine as well, aren't there?
There certainly are. And there's a real cachet attached to owning your own vineyard. So I think the Napa Valley, don't quote me because this is just a guess. Somebody did tell me once, I can't remember the exact number, but it's something like $100,000 an acre for good terroir, to use the wrong word.
A lovely term. Yeah.
And if you own your own vineyard, then you have your own label with your name on it, and Hollywood stars and other people are buying the land up, which is ramping the price up. They can't sell their, even at $100 a bottle, they're still making a loss because the land is so expensive. But people do collect American wines. And ever since that famous judgment of Paris, when there was a blind tasting of Californian wines against French wines, and all the judges were French, they would say, this is a miserable Chardonnay. It has to be American. And it wasn't. It was a Merceau or something like that. And Stag's Leap, I think it was, the Californian Cabernet Sauvignon, won the best red wine, ahead of Haut-Briand and things like that. The best white wine was also Californian. And ever since then, people have started to sit up and take notice. And the Americans were much more scientific in their approach than the French were. So they had enologists and scientists at universities in California working out the chemistry of the thing and how to prepare the land. And they were much cleaner in the way they picked and looked after the vats.
I was about to say, actually, I think a good comparison is to see when you're looking at a lovely Burgundy vineyards with some rather interesting characters with a gitan in one hand and a beer in the other, whilst picking the grapes. And in California, they're all in virtually hazmat suits and picking them in a very refined manner, shall we say.
Well, no, I mean, the French are getting the hang of what's going on, but hygiene in the whole process of creating the wine is absolutely crucial. Well, couldn't be more topical, could it? And the French were very sloppy and their wines had slipped. They just were resting on their laurels. That's not true anymore. They've had to come to terms with what is now a vast world market, and there's lots of great wine being produced all around the world. I think the statistic is something like 36 billion bottles produced in the year around the world. That's a lot of wine. In order to sell your product, you've got to make sure that it's fairly priced and good quality.
So in terms of not just a collector's market, but on an everyday level, I think the producers of wine have had to up their game, be it the quality, be it pricing.
I think the first thing that happened was, in a very simple way, when people started to realize that if you control the speed at which fermentation takes place, the wine will improve. Fermentation generates a lot of heat. So if you do something very simple, and fermentation happens too quickly, the wines don't have any quality to them. All you have to do while fermentation is going on is run some cold water down the sides of the vats, especially effective if they're in steel vats. And you can make the process take 16 days as opposed to 10, for instance. And that is absolutely crucial to the quality of the wine at the end. It's a very simple thing to do. Everyone knows how to do that now. So when I was a kid, it was extremely easy to go into a pub and buy a bottle of wine that was virtually undrinkable. The only brand you could get in those days was called Corrida. I think it came from Spain, but there's no guarantee, and it tasted quite like ink. These days, it's very difficult to find a bad bottle of wine. It's all pretty well made. They know how to do it. And for under £10, you can buy things that are truly delicious.
Now, when people collecting, we touched on it briefly before, David, but generally people, so these people with good collections of wine, are they buying it as investment or are they buying it to drink? And if they're buying it to drink, surely they must be appreciating the fact that for every bottle they have, theoretically, they're driving the price up because of the lack of other bottles that are available.
Yes, that is definitely true. It reminds me of the story, it may be apocryphal, about the man who bought 2 stamps, and there were only 2 in the world. And he decided to destroy, it's probably a Roald Dahl story, destroy one to make more than twice as valuable as the 2. Most of the people I come in contact with do occasionally sell wine, but for the most part, they're buying the things to drink or possibly pass on as an investment to their children. But yes, the more it's drunk, in theory, the more it's going to go up, especially if it's a wine or a port from one of those really hallowed vintages. In the case of port, 27, 45, 63, 77, 94, I think that there are only 5 vintages in the last century that people rarely take notice of. And if you came across a bottle of Taylor's 45, it would be I know a man who bought 2 pipes of Taylor's 45. It would be a terrific investment.
But would you feel that having it sat on a shelf and not being able, well, sat in a cellar rather, and not being able to drink it, as a connoisseur, does that defeat the object?
I would guess most people who buy things for investment buy enough that they've got some to drink and some as an investment. And there was always a trick if you could get an allocation in the 70s or 80s of if you could buy twice as much wine as you needed, if you could get the allocations. If you kept it for 10 years and then started to sell half of what you bought 10 years ago, you could finance your wine drinking. You would be drinking for free eventually, because things were just going up in value so much. But it's not that easy. And there are too many rich people and not enough great wine to go around. Yes, go on.
Speaking about investments and too many rich people that buy it, we have to really touch on something that was maybe, I don't know, 10 years or so ago, maybe a little bit longer, something that really came out that kind of, I would say, shocked the wine industry. A fairly recent phenomenon, or what I would think is a recent phenomenon, and of wine forgery. Now, is it like, I don't know, for example, Old Masters, where things were being copied in period, or is it a fairly 20th century thing that people are looking at things and actually trying to forge these wines?
I think it's a relatively modern phenomenon. I think in the last 20 years, that's when the prices really started to rocket. And I know that recently in China, people were going around the backs of restaurants and taking away all the expensive looking empty bottles, rebottling them, corking them, and passing them on in the secondary market. So I believe in China now they break all the bottles after they've served and decanted the wine. So I think people in China are just making their own bottles and their own labels. But there have been some spectacular frauds with fine wines in the last few years. There was a book that was published by Random House called Billionaire's Vinegar. And this was about various wines that people were suspicious of. they all came from a bon vivant, film producing, rock band managing guy called Hardy Rodenstock.
Yep, I know him.
Real name Reinhard Gerke, I think. Anyway, he had some of the most spectacular wine tastings of all time. He organized, I can't remember how long ago it was, for argument's sake, 20 years ago, a tasting of Chateau Yquem, which had wines from the 18th century, wines from the 19th century, and every single vintage from 1900 to 1991. The tasting went on over a week with feasting at both lunchtime and for dinner. And this
Did you have an invite, David?
Sadly not. I wish I had. Anyway, he was a great connoisseur, but he understood that there was so much enthusiasm and so many rich people that if you started making wines that people wanted, especially very old ones, that there was a ready-made market. And he passed off, the most memorable of all the things he did was to buy some wines somewhere in Paris. And as he explained the story, he was not specific about who he bought them from or what street they'd been found in. But the story was that some builders were enlarging a cellar in a Paris house, and they struck through accidentally into the cellar of the house next door, which was full of wine bottles, great clarets, and all the bottles were incised TH full stop J. And the story was that they were Thomas Jefferson's, President of the United States, founding father of the USA, and a great enophile. And it was a fabulous story. Later on, it transpired that people said that the incisions in the bottles were made with an electronic drill and couldn't possibly be 18th century. More interestingly, the bottles were opened, or one was, to taste it. And he had if the story in Billionaire's Vinegar is to be believed, he had put in old wines and wines from the 1930s and concocted a sort of brew that was completely believable, as were the old bottles and so on. And amongst them was Mouton Rothschild, although it wasn't called that then. I think it was called Bram Mouton. And there was Chateau Lafite and all the great clarets that we know and love. Thomas Jefferson was a strangely fastidious man, and in his lifetime he wrote 40,000 letters, and he kept a copy of each one. And at his house in Virginia, the archivist there was a bit suspicious about all of this, so went through the periods when he lived in Paris and traveled down to Bordeaux and could find no mention of Bram Mouton. So Hardy Rodenstock had actually chosen a wine that Jefferson wasn't interested in because he was been bound to have mentioned it in his correspondence. He took vines back to Virginia himself. He was very keen to see if they could grow wines, and it's got such a humid and hot summer climate that all the vines got mildew and it was a disaster. Now, however, I was in Virginia about 6 years ago. There is a wine trail that takes you to 136 vineyards in Virginia alone, where you can eat food and taste their wines. They're making great wines in Virginia now. And I think it's true to say that wine is now produced in every state of the USA, including Alaska.
I was about to ask, Alaska and Hawaii, obviously it is.
It's done under polythene. It's either a polytunnel or a greenhouse, but they make wine in Alaska and they make wine in Hawaii. So every state of the USA has wine.
Fantastic. And we're just going back to the forgeries kind of thing. I know of the work that you were talking about there, and I think it was absolutely fascinating that a lot of these people actually managed to to almost formulate a wine that was totally believable to a lot of other people's noses that actually did genuinely believe that it was right. It had all the right attributes. The bottles and everything else were right, apart from a few little issues that I think were one of the downfall of one of the people that was actually involved in it. But David, we've had a question from the floor here, which was going to be one of my questions, so it fits in quite nicely. Now, if I was looking to put together a small investment collection, how should I go about it? And what would you suggest to buy and where to buy from? And would there be somewhere to store that you would recommend?
Yes, storage is a big problem because
I'm assuming the value of a wine, if you can prove it's been in a bonded warehouse, it would be more significant than if you said it's been kept in my cellar, because I suppose there's no way of tracing how an item's been kept.
No, I think if the wine's still in its original wooden case and it doesn't have any damp marks and things on it and the labels are all in good condition, you assume it's been correctly stored. But you're quite right. If it's been stored in a professional warehouse, that's all to the good. What has happened, though, on several occasions in the past is that wine investment agents and wine merchants have stored your wine, their stock, everything else together. And if they've gone bust, the wine they're storing for you is indistinguishable from theirs, and your asset becomes theirs. So in answer to, obviously the most reputable wine merchants, you know, the Justoinis, Berry Brothers, Cornier and Barrow, Farr Vintners and so on, they're going to give you pretty good advice. You would have to decide what you wanted to collect and who had in some instances there's only a unique agency in Britain, so you'd have to go with whoever had the wine, and if they're good and reputable, then nothing's going to go wrong. If you chanced your own arm, then I think buying fairly recent vintages at auction, so long as you keep an eye on the pricing, buying at auction is a sensible thing to do. There's a vehicle called Wine Searcher. There's a professional one that you have to subscribe to and another one, but you can just check worldwide to see what the prices are and go to auction and bid accordingly. Unless you also, the other possibility is that you could, if you weren't buying the top clarets, just go to the chateau themselves and see if you can't negotiate a small allocation of the wines directly from the chateau. You won't get a better price, but...
You spoke briefly about this allocation system, so I'm assuming top chateaus these days will basically, many years before the vintage, will actually say, okay, well, we're designating a certain amount of cases to you and a certain amount of cases to you. This is your allocation, you pay for it up front, and we will deliver it to you, or you will collect it from a specific point. Is that very much the case now?
Yeah, that is pretty much the case. And that was always the case if you were a negociant in Bordeaux and you wanted to get the best wines. But what you had to do, and here was the catch, you had to guarantee to take 200 cases irrespective of the vintage. You couldn't just have the 1970. You had to have the 2013 too. And in the case of 2013, which was a disastrous year because of the weather, the negociant was stuffed with this stuff that they can't sell. Lathwaite, very amusingly, in one of his magazines, said, 2013, the vintage that slipped under the radar. It didn't slip. Everybody knew it was just hopeless. I bought two bottles of good wine. I bought a Listrac and a Chateau Pape Clement in Lidl from that vintage, just to see what they were like. They were quite cheap, but they were very disappointing.
I'm assuming you've probably seen some of the webinars that I've done with some other people when they're talking about art. And even if they're looking at it from an investment point of view, the general consensus is you should buy what you love and what you want to live with. I'm assuming then that with wine, buy what you like to drink, because ultimately if it plummets in value, it's there in your cellar and you can enjoy it.
It's absolutely true. Of course, it's particularly true of paintings. If you buy something for investment, you're going to probably fall flat on your face. If you buy something you like, then 10 to 1, somebody else will like it too. And of course, that's true of wine. I mean, if you if I'd been prescient and thought harder about Henri Jaillet's Vin Roman Necropolon, I probably wouldn't have drunk it. But yes, if you buy what you like, and the other thing to remember is, if you're buying these top wines, which is obviously the safest place to be for investment, you are going to like them. There are no two ways about it. If you allow them to reach the moment when they're best to drink, they're going to be a tremendous pleasure. Yeah, and if the world goes crazy and we're locked in for the rest of our lives, then to have a great cellar would be a consolation.
I should say so.
Speaking of which, I tried to telephone Majestic in Bicester, near where I live, and they said, sorry, we're rushed off our feet. We're not answering the telephone. Can you send us an email? You got a thing from Tony Laithwaite saying, there's no point me sending out a brochure of the wines that are available, because by the time you ring up, they won't be available. So please contact us by email. And I heard that Yap Brothers in Mere, who specialize in wines from Australia, the Rhone and Languedoc, 3 weeks ago had their best single day's trading in 51 years. And there's no hotel business, no pub, no restaurant business. This is entirely retailing to the general public. March then was better than December, better than Christmas and New Year put together.
So, I suppose it's one of those things. I mean, thankfully, I managed to get in at Laithwaite's fairly early and get 3 cases to see me through this. So hopefully we'll be okay. David, I asked this of every specialist that we have in. What's the favourite kind of item they've held, or what's the favourite piece that they've dealt with? What's the best glass of wine you've ever had, and what was the circumstance?
Well, I've actually got the bottle here because it was going to illustrate something completely different. I'll hold it up and see if it can you see that? Can you see the label?
Well, a lovely bottle of Pomerol, but I think we can just about make it out there, David.
Is it visible? Well,
yes, yeah, I can see the Avery's label on there, certainly.
Well, this was a bottle of Chateau Petrus 1953. And I ordered a case of house claret from Justarini's, and they duly arrived. And they mostly had maroon capsules, apart from one that was a sort of bright vermilion. So I took it out of the case and had a look and thought, oh, it's just a joke. They're just winding me up. Because it says Chateau Petrus Pomerol, and then it says Avery's of Bristol. The word chateau is misspelt. I'm sorry that doesn't show up. So I just thought, and it's got no vintage label on it. So I rang them up and said, somebody's winding me up. There's a bottle of Petrus here, and the word chateau is misspelled. And then they said, no, that's the 1953. And I said, well, I'll drop it round as soon as I can. They said, no, hang on to it, drink it. Well, I waited 20 years and then I drank it, and it was absolutely phenomenal. I drank it with my family, and I said, let's drink it quickly because it's so old, it might be one of those wines where the genie is out of the bottle and it'll just fade very quickly. Yeah. So drink it fast. And there was still some left in the bottle because I only gave them half a glass to start with. And it was still absolutely wonderful an hour later. It had held together perfectly. And apparently in those days, in the 50s, they shipped the wines, Petrus and other Chateau, in barrels because they thought it was a safer way for the wine. And then they were bottled and labelled in England, whence the misspelling of Chateau. And apparently Avery's would bottle a few hundred in 1 year, and 6 months later they'd do another batch, and 6 months after that, and they all had 1953 on them, even though they were bottled 18 months apart. With wines like that, there's no consistency to the quality. They all behave quite differently. So that's something to watch out for if you're buying an old wine and it's got an English label. It won't necessarily have behaved in the way the last bottle did.
It's all one-offs, aren't they? I think that's the issue. Yeah. David, I'm afraid we're out of time now, but that was absolutely fascinating. I do thank you ever so much for your time, and I don't know about you, but I'm almost ready for a glass of wine now. I think after that.
Before you go, just one thing we should all do tonight is to raise a glass to Colonel Tom Moore on his 100th birthday. If ever we need an excuse for a glass of wine, it's him.
Bravo, David. I totally agree. A lovely gesture, though. A lovely gesture. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you ever so much for joining me. Please do get in touch with us if there are any more specific subjects you'd like to cover in any of these webinars. We're all ears and love talking to you. And the feedback we've been getting is phenomenal. Next week, I'm going to be talking about watches with Mary Waterfall, and one of my favourite designers of all time, Gerald Genta. Amazing chap who worked for Patek Philippe, Audemars Piguet, Bulgari, many more. Thanks again to David, and we'll see you all very soon, and we'll see you next week. Take care. Bye-bye.